Bitterroot Crossing, Montana Territory, November 1878. The gun barrel pressed against her forehead, cold as iron, steady as a death sentence. Smoke, fire, a blizzard screaming through every crack in the walls. The man smiled. Tell them to stand down and nobody gets hurt. Genevieve St. James looked straight into his eyes. No fear, no flinching, just counting. 1, 2. The derringer came out from under her skirt. Crack, he hit the floor. She stepped over him, clean, deliberate, never looked back. She boarded that train in Philadelphia with $32, a stolen ledger, and blood soaking through green silk, and nobody knew she was about to change everything. This is Evie St. James, and her story starts right now. The train didn't slow down for Bitterroot Crossing, so much as it surrendered to it. Steam hissed and brakes screamed against frozen iron rails as the locomotive ground to a stop at the edge of nowhere. Montana Territory. November had buried the platform under 8 inches of snow, and the wind off the Bitterroot Range wasn't just cold, it had teeth. It bit through wool, through bone, through whatever desperate hope a person might carry in their chest. The depot itself was barely more than a wooden shed with a rusted lantern swinging outside it. One old man huddled beneath the overhang, clutching a sheepskin coat around his shoulders and squinting through the white. He wasn't expecting anyone on the 1140 southbound. Nobody came to Bitterroot Crossing in November, not by choice. So when the first-class car door opened, he blinked twice to make sure he wasn't dreaming. She stepped off the iron step like she was walking out of a painting someone had slashed with a blade. The dress was emerald silk, the kind that cost more than a working man's annual wage, with tiny pearl buttons up the bodice and Belgian lace at the throat. But the lace was torn. The left sleeve hung by threads, and across the front of that beautiful green skirt, dark and dried and rust-colored now against the silk, was blood. Not a little blood. Her dark hair had half fallen from its pins. One glove was missing. She stepped onto the platform, and her heel broke through a crust of ice, and she lurched forward, but caught herself on the wooden railing, fingers gripping hard. She stood there for a moment, just breathing. Her breath came out in short, frantic clouds of white vapor. She was young, terribly young, and she was alone. She looked left. She looked right. She didn't recognize a single thing about this place, and her face showed every second of that panic before she wrestled it back down behind her teeth. Her name was Genevieve St. James. She was 21 years old. 3 nights ago, she had been in Philadelphia, inside a brownstone townhouse that smelled of cigar smoke and imported cognac, and a man with silver hair and cold gray eyes had clasped a bracelet around her wrist, the way a man clasps a chain around a gate. Her father had watched and said nothing. Her father had smiled. She had stopped calling him father somewhere around Louisville. The black ledger was still pressed flat against her ribs, tucked inside her corset stays, where no one would find it without a very personal search. It was the only thing she'd grabbed when she ran. 14 pages of neat accountant's script, numbers and names and dates and property deeds. Proof. She didn't fully understand all of it yet, but she knew enough. She knew the man whose bracelet she'd snapped off and left on the parlor floor had buried 3 women already, and that he had intended her to be the 4th. She wasn't going to be the 4th. She pushed herself off the railing and took 3 steps forward, then 4, and then the cold hit her properly. Not the surface cold she'd felt through the train window glass. The real cold. The Montana in November. Wind off the mountains. God help. You cold. It went straight through the thin silk like the fabric wasn't even there. Her whole body seized. She kept walking anyway. She didn't know where she was walking to. The shed, maybe. Somewhere out of the wind. Somewhere to think, to figure out what a woman does when she has $32, a stolen ledger, no coat, and nothing behind her worth going back to. She made it maybe 20 feet past the shed before her legs simply stopped cooperating. It wasn't a dramatic fall. There was no cry. Her knees buckled quiet as candles going out, and she went down sideways into the snow, and the cold rose up to meet her like it had been waiting. The old man under the overhang made a sound, took a half step forward, then froze, because someone else was already moving. He'd been standing in the shadow beside the depot's eastern wall. She hadn't seen him. Most people didn't see Gideon Thorne unless he wanted them to. 34 years old, built like the mountains he'd grown up in, with a scar that ran from his left cheekbone to his jaw and eyes the color of winter river water. He wore a coat made from a whole bear pelt, cured himself, and he'd come to the depot to collect a parts order from the ironworks in Billings. He'd seen her the moment she stepped off the train. He'd watched, not with the hungry, calculating look she would have recognized and feared. He'd watched the way a man watches something that doesn't fit a bird flying the wrong direction before a storm. His jaw tightened. He didn't move while she was still on her feet. He understood, without having to reason it through, that a woman in a torn ball gown, stepping off a train alone in a blizzard, was a woman who had already survived something. The least he could do was let her try to keep surviving it on her own terms for as long as she was able. But when her knees hit the snow, he moved. He crossed the distance in 6 long strides and crouched beside her in one motion. And his voice was low and even, no alarm in it, just steady. The same voice he'd used on the battlefield when scared boys needed to hear something human. "I've got you," he said. "You're all right." She was barely conscious. Her lips had gone the wrong color, faint purple at the edges, her skin like paper. He got one arm under her shoulders and one under her knees, and he lifted her. She weighed almost nothing inside all that silk, and that told him something, too. Something that made the muscle in his jaw work again. She stirred, enough to try to pull back from him, some last animal instinct firing through the hypothermia. Her fingers curled against his coat. The word came out barely a whisper. I'm not going to hurt you." Simple, matter of fact. He'd said it before in his life. To people in bad situations, there's a storm coming in hard. "I need to get you warm." He shrugged off the bear pelt coat, one-handed, without putting her down, a feat of quiet, practiced strength, and wrapped it around her from chin to ankle before he lifted her again. The coat swallowed her whole. She was shaking so hard he could feel it against his chest, deep, uncontrollable tremors, her body fighting for its own life. The old man at the overhang took a step forward. "She off the southbound? Should we send for somebody?" Gideon looked at the sky. The clouds to the northwest were moving wrong, the greenish-gray dark of a serious blizzard, not an hour out. He looked down at the woman in his arms. She was fading again, lashes fluttering against the bare fur. "Get word to Doc Miller. She'll need warming supplies. Brought up by morning if the road's still clear," he said. "But I'm not leaving her in that shed." He carried her to the sled he'd left at the far edge of the platform, the 2 gray drafts standing patient and steam-breathed in the cold. He settled her across the seat and climbed up and tucked the fur tighter around her and clicked his tongue at the horses. The sled moved. The blizzard rolled in behind them like a curtain dropping. She drifted in and out for most of the hours right up the ridge road, and at one point her eyes opened and fixed on the side of his face with something sharp in them. Something wary and measuring. Whatever she'd been through had taught her not to trust easily. He respected that even as it cut at him somewhere he didn't examine. Where she started. "Bitterroot Ridge," he said. "My homestead. It's safe, a beat. You can decide what comes next when you're not freezing to death." She looked at him another long moment. Then she looked away, up at the black pines whipping in the wind on either side of the road, at the snow coming down thick and sideways now. She pulled the bear coat tighter with fingers that were only barely beginning to work again. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect it. What she said, just before she slipped under again, was quiet enough that the wind almost took it. But he heard, "I'm not going back." Gideon kept his eyes on the road ahead. The horses leaned into the climb. The blizzard closed in around them, like the whole world was reducing. To just this, the sled runners on hard snow, the lantern swinging, and the steady breathing of a woman who had no idea yet how fierce she was going to have to become. "No," he said to the dark and the storm, and no one in particular. "You're not." The homestead lights glowed gold through the trees at the top of the ridge. Up ahead, the mountain waited. The first thing Evie noticed when she came back to herself was warmth. Not the careful, rationed warmth of a fire kept small so the servants wouldn't burn too much wood. Real warmth, the deep surrounding kind that came from thick log walls and a fireplace big enough to stand in, and four men who clearly didn't believe in doing anything halfway. The flames had been built up high and steady, casting amber across the ceiling beams, and somewhere nearby. Something was simmering broth, she thought, and her stomach clenched so hard it nearly doubled her over. She was in a bed. A real one, with a quilt heavy enough to press her into the mattress, and her ruined silk dress had been replaced by a flannel nightgown that was about 4 sizes too large and smelled like cedar and clean air. She sat up so fast the room tilted. Her hand went immediately to her ribs. She pressed. Felt the familiar flat shape through the flannel. The ledger was still there. She let out a breath that had been building since Philadelphia. Then she looked around the room and took stock, the way her mother had taught her before her mother died and left her alone with a man who saw daughters as currency. Stone fireplace to the left. Heavy oak door, closed but not locked. She could see the latch was up. One window shuddered against what sounded like a full mountain blizzard. A wardrobe, a washstand, a ladder-back chair with her torn emerald dress folded over it. Folded, not thrown. Folded with some care, the least stained side facing up. On the washstand was a small eating knife, just sitting there, handle toward her. She stared at it for a moment. Then she picked it up, swung her legs off the bed, and stood. The floor was cold through wool socks that were not hers. She didn't remember putting on wool socks. She pushed that thought aside and moved to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. Voices. Low. She caught fragments. Still asleep when I checked an hour ago. Let her sleep. Ezra says the hypothermia wasn't as bad as it looked. It looked pretty bad, Gideon. I know what it looked like. She stepped back from the door. Counted her heartbeats. 4 of them out there. The big man from the sled had said no, he hadn't said that. She didn't actually know how many people were in this house. She knew one man had carried her here. She knew she'd woken up in clean clothes. She knew the knife on the washstand had been placed where she could reach it. That last detail was either very reassuring or very calculated. She gripped the knife, lifted the latch, and opened the door. The main room opened up before her, like something out of a storybook about the frontier. If the person writing that storybook had actually been to the frontier and understood that survival required function before beauty. The ceilings were high. The timber walls were thick, double-planked, with rifle ports cut between the logs at shoulder height and fitted with wooden plugs that could be pulled in under a minute. The fireplace was massive, fieldstone from floor to ceiling, and the mantel above it held a row of oil lamps and a battered surveyor's compass and a child's wooden horse that looked very old and very loved. The furniture was heavy, handmade, built for men of considerable size, which made immediate sense when she saw them. They were standing at various points around the room, and they all went still when she appeared in the doorway. The one from the sled was the tallest. The scar along his jaw caught the firelight. He was at the far end of the room near a table, spread with maps, and he didn't move toward her. He just looked at her with those gray river water eyes and waited. To his left, near the fire, sat the broadest man she had ever seen in her life. He was maybe 6'3", of solid, quiet mass, with hands that could have wrapped around a fence post and dark hair, cropped short. He had a piece of wood in those enormous hands, and he'd been carving something before he stopped. He didn't get up either. He just watched her with calm, dark eyes and set the carving down slowly, like he was making sure she could see exactly what his hands were doing. The third man was crouched by the fireplace, adding a log, and he rose to his feet with an easy, loose-limbed grace that spoke of someone who moved through wild spaces for a living. He had sandy hair and a grin that appeared to be his natural resting expression, and blue eyes that caught light the way river water did. He was the youngest of the three visible ones, or close to it, and he raised both hands palm out when he stood up, easy and unhurried. "Morning," he said, "or evening, hard to tell with the storm. You want coffee?" The fourth man came in from a side door, drying his hands on a cloth, and he nearly ran into her with the focused distraction of someone who'd been thinking hard about something else. He pulled up short. He was the leanest of them, with dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the careful, observant stillness of a man trained to read people before he spoke to them. He looked at the knife in her hand. He looked at her face. He took a small step backward and gave her room. "You've been unconscious for almost 14 hours, he said. "I'm Ezra. I'm a doctor. I checked you over last night, nothing beyond the cold and some old bruising. I didn't remove anything from your person." He said it, plainly, without embarrassment. "Your belongings are exactly as you had them." His eyes flicked briefly to her ribs and away again. He'd felt the ledger when he assessed her. She could tell. He wasn't going to mention it. Something in her grip on the knife loosened by about half a degree. The tall one by the maps finally spoke. "You want to sit down? I want to know where I am and what you want from me." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Good. I want to know that before I sit anywhere." A pause moved through the room. The sandy-haired one, still with his hands up, glanced at the big, quiet man by the fire, who gave the smallest possible nod, as if to say, "Go ahead, she's earned a straight answer." The tall one, Gideon, she'd heard the name through the door, moved to the table and pulled out a chair. Not for her, for himself. He sat down, which brought his head to a less towering height, and he set his hands flat on the table, where she could see them. "This is Bitterroot Ridge," he said, "my homestead. That's my brother Ezra, the one who just introduced himself. The man by the fire is Jeddah Stone, our blacksmith. The one with his hands in the air is Larkin Hayes. He's our tracker and sharpshooter, and he will put his hands down now." Larkin lowered his hands, still grinning. "The coffee offer stands, by the way." Gideon continued. "We put an advertisement in the Philadelphia Examiner 6 months ago, looking for a woman willing to come west as part of a legal family unit. Not what you're thinking," he added, because her face had changed. "Let me explain." She didn't sit, but she put her back against the doorframe so she could see the whole room, and she listened. He explained it with the same economy he seemed to apply to everything. Under the Homestead Act, individual land claims were increasingly vulnerable. Railroad companies had legal teams and government connections, and a habit of finding paperwork irregularities in the claims of men who lived alone on valuable land. A registered family unit had more legal standing, more claim rights. The advertisement had been honest about the arrangement, a mutual partnership, shared resources, shared legal protection. The woman who answered would have her own room, her own income share from the timber and mineral rights, and complete freedom to leave if the arrangement didn't suit her. "The woman who answered," Evie said. "That wasn't me." "No," Gideon said. "It wasn't." He didn't ask her who she was or how she'd ended up in a blood-stained ball gown on a Montana platform in November. She understood he wasn't going to, unless she offered it. The restraint was notable. "A woman named Clara Whitmore wrote back to us," Ezra said quietly. "We'd been corresponding for 2 months. She was supposed to be on the southbound last night." He paused. "You were the only person who got off." Evie thought about that. She didn't know a Clara Whitmore. She'd chosen Bitterroot crossing off a map because it was the most remote-looking stop before the train turned back east, and she needed to be somewhere remote. She'd spent her last $20 on a first-class ticket because first-class cars had lockable compartment doors. "I'm sorry about your correspondent," she said, and she meant it. Jed spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and unhurried, like a bell struck once and left to resonate. You don't need to be sorry for anything. Evie looked at him. He picked the carving back up and turned it over in his hands she could see. Now it was a small horse, similar to the one on the mantel. He wasn't looking at her. He was giving her space to breathe without the weight of 4 sets of eyes on her face. She thought about Philadelphia again, about the parlor and the cognac smell and the bracelet clicking shut. What happens now? He stood up, walked to the near end of the table, laid 3 things down on the wood in a row, deliberate and unhurried. A key on a simple iron ring, a leather pouch that clinked with coin, and last, a Colt .45 revolver, fully loaded from the weight of it when he set it down. He stepped back from all of it. "You're no prisoner, Evie," he said. "If you want to leave tomorrow, Larkin will drive you to the junction. If you stay, you hold equal power in this house." She stared at the 3 objects on the table. The key, the money, the gun. She'd been given jewelry and dresses, and a room with a lock on the outside. She'd been handed ledgers to sign and contracts to smile over, and a bracelet like a brand. She had never, in 21 years of living, been given a key, money of her own, and a weapon, and told they were hers to do with as she chose. Her throat did something complicated that she refused to let reach her face. She walked to the table. She picked up the Colt, first checked the cylinder, counted the rounds, clicked it shut, and set it back down. Larkin made a small sound that might have been approval. Then she picked up the coin pouch and the key and held them. I'll stay," she said. "For now." She met Gideon's eyes. "I have information that might matter to your situation here. When I'm ready to share it, I will." He nodded once. "No negotiation." "No pressing, Larkin," he said. "Get the woman some food." "Already on it," Larkin said, and headed for the kitchen like he'd been waiting for permission. Evie stood in the firelight, with a key and a pouch of silver in her hands, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, no one in the room wanted anything from her at all. It was the strangest feeling she'd ever had. It felt distantly and terrifyingly like the beginning of something. By the 4th morning, Evie had cleaned the main room 3 times, not because it needed it. The first time, yes, there was mud tracked in from the night of the blizzard, and ash scattered from the fireplace, and general evidence of 4 men who were competent at surviving, but less devoted to tidiness. She'd cleaned that and felt useful, which was a feeling she trusted. The second time, she'd noticed a smear on the window glass and went after it, and then kept going. The third time, she'd woken before dawn, with her heart hammering from a dream she couldn't quite remember. And by the time gray light started edging through the shutters, she'd scrubbed the hearthstone and reorganized the kitchen shelves and was on her knees, working at a scuff on the floorboards near the door when Ezra came downstairs for the morning. He stood at the foot of the stairs for a moment, watching her. She scrubbed harder. "Evie." "It's fine," she said, before he could say anything. "I don't mind, it's something to do." He went to the kitchen and came back with 2 cups of coffee and sat down on the bottom stair step and held 1 cup out toward her without comment. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. She took it. "You've cleaned this room more in 4 days than we've managed in the last 3 months, he said. "You're busy, men." "We are," he agreed. "But that's not why I'm mentioning it." She wrapped both hands around the tin cup and said nothing. Ezra was quiet for a moment, studying the steam rising from his own coffee. He had the particular stillness of a man who had learned that silence was often more useful than words, and who applied it with precision. "Can I tell you something I've observed? Professionally." She looked at him sideways. A small smile crossed his face. "When Jed came in late 2 nights ago, with mud on his boots, you were up and moving to find the mop before he'd finished apologizing. The floors. When Larkin forgot to bank the fire before bed and the room cooled down, you got up at 2 in the morning to fix it and then stayed up to make sure it caught properly." She opened her mouth. "When Gideon thanked you for the supper you made," Ezra continued, even-toned and without accusation, "you apologized that the biscuits hadn't risen quite right." Silence. Outside, the wind had died down from the blizzard's peak, but snow still fell in steep curtains past the shuttered windows. The fire popped. Somewhere overhead, boots moved across the floorboards, Jed or Larkin. Early risers both. "I'm not useful for much else at the moment," she said finally. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "I don't know this land. I don't know your animals. I'm—" She stopped. "You're waiting," Ezra said quietly. "For the moment someone decides you're not worth keeping around. So you're making yourself indispensable before that happens." The accuracy of it landed like a stone, dropped into still water. She felt the ripples moving outward and worked very hard not to show it on her face. "I'd like to be useful," she said.
That's all.
Ezra turned his cup slowly in his hands. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it. Not just let it pass through." He waited until she looked at him directly. "What you're describing, that compulsion to work before anyone can find fault with you, that preemptive apologizing, that monitoring of other people's moods so you can respond before they escalate, those aren't personality traits. They're survival strategies. You learned them because at some point, staying small and useful kept you safe." She looked back at the fire. "The problem," he said, "is that you're still running those strategies in a house where no one is going to punish you for sitting down." He let that sit for a moment. A woman's value is not measured by her docility. At Bitterroot, you have the right to rest, the right to say no, and the right to be angry. The silence that followed was long enough that the fire settled and a log shifted with a soft crash of embers. "That's easy to say," Evie said. "I know. Knowing a thing and being able to do it aren't the same." "No," he agreed. "They're not. That's why I'm not telling you to just stop. I'm telling you what's actually happening, so you can start to see it when it comes up." He finished his coffee. "Your nervous system learned a pattern. It can learn a new one. But it takes time and it takes safety. And you have both here." She looked down at her own hands around the tin cup, red at the knuckles from the cold water she'd been scrubbing with. She hadn't even noticed. Slowly, she set the scrub brush on the hearthstone. "The biscuits," she said, after a moment. "What about them?" "They actually weren't very good. The altitude does something to the rising." I wasn't fishing for reassurance. Ezra laughed. It was a genuine laugh, quiet and warm, and it changed his face completely. "Fair enough," he said. "I'll show you the altitude adjustment. Jed figured it out the first winter we were here. Took him 3 batches. How many biscuits did Jed eat in the process of figuring it out?" An embarrassing number. She almost smiled. It surprised her enough that she looked away quickly, but she thought he saw it anyway. The boots overhead came down the stairs, and it was Larkin, fully dressed for cold weather, and carrying his rifle case over one shoulder. He stopped when he saw both, sitting there with coffee cups, looking like they'd been having a serious conversation. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked. "No," Ezra said, and stood up. "I'm going to check on Gideon's shoulder." "Larkin, didn't you say you were going to take Evie out to the range today?" Larkin's eyes moved to her, and the grin came back. The easy default of it. "If she wants, no pressure." She looked at the rifle case. She looked at the window, where pale winter light was starting to filter through the cracks in the shutters. She'd spent 3 days inside these walls. She'd cleaned them 3 times. She'd made 4 men breakfast, and darned 2 pairs of socks and reorganized a pantry. And she had not once been outside, where she could see the sky. "Yes," she said. "I want." Larkin raised an eyebrow, like her decisiveness had pleasantly surprised him. "Good. Dress warm. Montana in November is not fooling around." She borrowed a coat Jed's, which came to her knees, and weighed nearly as much as she did, and a pair of Larkin's gloves, with the fingers cut short for trigger work, and Larkin's spare hat pulled down over her ears. She looked ridiculous. She didn't care. He led her around the east side of the homestead to a long, flat stretch of cleared ground that ran between the house and the tree line, marked at the far end by a split-rail fence with tin cans set along the top rail and a painted board target nailed to a post. The snow was packed down here from use, and she could see the marks of previous shooting sessions, boot prints, and the tiny craters where expelled brass had landed. Larkin crouched and opened the rifle case. But he didn't take out the rifle first. He took out a Colt .45 revolver smaller than Gideon's, lighter, with worn grips that fit a medium-sized hand. "We'll start here," he said. He held it out to her grip first. She took it. It was heavier than her Derringer, which she still kept tucked at her thigh, and the balance was different. She turned it over in her hands. "You've held a gun before," he said. "Not a question. My grandfather's. When I was 12. She checked the cylinder empty. He'd made sure of that, and dry-fired it twice to feel the trigger pull. He didn't think women should be helpless. Smart man. He was the only one who thought so. She handed it back. "Show me how to load it." He did. He was a good teacher patient, where it mattered, efficient where it didn't, and he explained everything without condescension. The terminology, the care, the difference between shooting to intimidate and shooting to stop a threat. She listened with total attention, the ledger keeper's part of her brain cataloging everything he said. When he finally handed her the loaded revolver and stepped back and said, "Whenever you're ready," she didn't hesitate. She raised her arm, found her stance, and fired. The crack was enormous. It split the cold mountain air and bounced off the canyon walls to the east and came back like an answer. Snow fell from the nearest pine branches. The tin can on the far left of the rail jumped and spun and landed in the snow. She stood there, with the gun still raised and smoke drifting from the barrel, breathing hard. Then she fired again. Another can. Again. The board target, dead center. Again, another can. The last shot, she took too fast and it went wide, kicking up snow 6 inches to the right of the post. And she lowered the gun and stood for a moment with the silence pressing in. All around her was white and pine and open sky. The canyon spread out below the ridge line to the south, the Bitterroot Range rising beyond it in massive dark shapes through the cloud cover. The air tasted like ice and pine resin and gunpowder. She was shaking slightly, not from fear, from something that felt distantly like recognizing herself. Larkin was quiet behind her for a beat longer than she expected. When she turned, his grin had changed from its habitual easy expression to something more genuine and less performed. He looked at her, the way people look at something they weren't expecting. "4 out of 5, he said. "First time you fired a Colt. The last one I pulled," she said. "You pulled it because you were excited. You'll learn to slow that down." He walked forward and collected the cans from the snow, resetting them on the rail. "Reload." She reloaded. She fired again and again. For the next hour, Larkin Hayes taught her marksmanship with the focused, economical attention of a man who respected what he was doing and respected her enough not to soften the instruction. He corrected her grip twice and her stance once, and didn't soften either correction. She appreciated that more than she could have explained. When they finally came in from the cold, fingers numb despite the cut glove liners and boots and packed with snow, Jed was at the kitchen work table, and there was bread rising near the fire, and the whole house smelled like wood smoke and something savory. He looked up when they came in. He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there made him set down the bread knife. "You hit anything?" he asked. "Most things," she said. The quiet smile that moved across his face was brief and without performance. He turned back to the bread. "Good," he said simply. Evie pulled off Jed's enormous coat and hung it on its peg by the door and stood in the warmth for a moment, with her hands tingling back to life. Her ears were still ringing faintly from the shots. The canyon echo was still in her chest somewhere. 4 tin cans and a painted target out on a snow-covered ridge in the middle of nowhere. She thought about the woman she'd been on that Philadelphia platform, with the bracelet around her wrist and her father smiling. She thought about the eating knife on the washstand the first morning. She thought about Ezra's voice over coffee. "Your nervous system learned a pattern. It can learn a new one." She went to the kitchen table, sat down across from Jed, and picked up the spare bread knife he'd left at the edge of the board. "Show me how to do that," she said. He looked at her. She meant the bread, the way he was shaping, and folding the dough, the technique in his enormous, careful hands. He pushed the dough toward her without a word. She put her hands in it and started to learn. December settled over Bitterroot Ridge like it owned the place. The snow came in waves, 2 days of heavy fall, then a brief, hard clearing where the sky went, the color of new iron, and the cold sharpened to something almost crystalline. Then another 2 days of white. Gideon tracked it on a weather chart, tacked to the wall beside the maps. Jed reinforced the stable walls with an extra layer of pine planking. Larkin came back from his trap lines each morning with frost in his hair and something over his shoulder. Ezra kept his medical bag packed and close because Montana winters had a talent for emergency. And Evie watched all of it and started slowly to understand the rhythm of the place. It wasn't like anything she'd been raised toward. In Philadelphia, the rhythm of a household was performance meals timed to impress, rooms arranged to signal wealth, conversation calibrated for effect. Everything in her father's house had an audience built into it somewhere. Everything meant something beyond itself. Here, things meant exactly what they were. Jed hammered iron because iron needed hammering. Larkin tracked because the traps needed checking. Ezra studied his medical journals by lamplight because there was a community of scattered homesteaders across 3 valleys who had no other doctor. Gideon managed the land ledgers because the railroad wasn't going to stop wanting what they had, and documentation was a weapon the law would actually recognize. And Evie, after 2 weeks of compulsive cleaning that Ezra quietly redirected 3 times without ever making her feel ashamed, started asking questions. The first one she asked Gideon. She found him at the big table one evening, surrounded by survey documents and land grant records, 2 oil lamps pulled close, a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. She set a fresh cup down to replace it, and then stood there for a moment, looking at the papers. "I can read a ledger," she said. He glanced up at her. "My grandfather was a cotton merchant before the war. He taught me double-entry bookkeeping when I was 9, because he said the women in his family were not going to be left helpless when the men died." She looked at the survey documents. "I was also very good at it." Gideon considered her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he pulled out the chair beside him. "Sit down," he said. "These land grant filings from the territorial office are a mess. The indexing doesn't match the parcel numbers, and I think 2 of the deeds reference the same ridge line under different survey dates." She sat. She looked at the first document. She found the indexing error in under 4 minutes. Gideon watched her do it with the careful attention of a man recalibrating something in his head. Not surprised, exactly. More like confirmed. "The second survey date is wrong," she said. "Someone transposed 2 digits on the parcel number. See, this should read 1,871, not 1,817. She set down her finger. "That makes the overlapping reference a clerical error, not a conflicting claim." "That's 3 weeks of worry resolved in 4 minutes, he said. "Bookkeeping is mostly about pattern recognition," she said. "And patience." She looked at him sideways. "I'd like to keep doing this, if you'll show me what I need to know about territorial law." He pulled another stack of documents toward her and started explaining. They worked at that table for 2 hours. He taught. She absorbed and applied and corrected 2 more indexing errors and asked precise, intelligent questions that he answered without simplifying them. When she pushed back on his interpretation of one mineral rights clause calmly, with a specific reason, he read it again and said, without any detectable difficulty, "You're right. She'd never had a man say that to her about intellectual work before. Not once in 21 years. She looked back at the document so he wouldn't see what was on her face. In the weeks that followed, a kind of organic division of purpose settled over the household, not an assigned one. Nothing was assigned. It developed through inclination and ability, and the simple fact that 4 very different men lived in a house and were all good at different things. Gideon taught Evie frontier contract law and land documentation. They spent whole evenings at the big table. the lamps burning low, his voice measured, and even as he walked her through the legal architecture that protected or failed to protect the people who'd staked claims out here. She was a fast study, faster than he expected, though he stopped being surprised by that after the first week. Jed built her a desk. He didn't announce it. He didn't ask if she wanted one. He simply appeared one afternoon with lumber and his tools and spent 3 quiet days in the corner of the main room, measuring and joining and fitting. And when it was done, he moved it to the space near the east window where the light came in longest during the short winter days, and set a new oil lamp on it. It was solid oak, with dovetail joints at the corners and a small carved border along the top edge, simple, geometric, the mark of a man who took craft seriously. It had a shallow drawer with a fitted lock, and he placed the key on top without comment and went back to his work. Evie stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she ran her fingers along the carved border. She opened the drawer. She closed it. She sat down in the ladder-back chair he'd positioned in front of it and put her hands flat on the surface. She could feel the work in it, the hours, the intention. "Jed," she said. He looked up from across the room. "Thank you." He nodded once, like the thanks was unnecessary but appreciated, and went back to his carving. That was Jed. He expressed things through what he made, through what he built and fixed and maintained and handed to the people around him without ceremony. She understood that once she stopped waiting for him to be something else. Larkin's approach was entirely different. He showed up at her door one morning with his hands behind his back and that grin already in place. She'd learned to read the gradations of Larkin's grin. By then there was the default public one, the one he wore like a hat. There was the sharper, more genuine one that appeared when he was actually pleased about something. And there was this one, which was somewhere in between and meant he'd done something he was quietly proud of. He brought his hands forward. Snow blossoms. A whole fistful of them. Tiny white flowers that grew on the south-facing slopes under the pine cover, pushing up through the surface snow where geothermal warmth seeped from the ground. She hadn't known anything bloomed in Montana in December. Apparently, if you knew where to look, things did. She took them and didn't know what to say. He didn't seem to need her to say anything. He just nodded like the transaction was complete and turned to leave. "Larkin." He turned back. "How far did you go to find these?" "Not far," he said, which she was fairly certain was a lie based on the snow still melting in his hair. She put the snow blossoms in a tin cup of water on her new desk, and they lasted 4 days, which she thought was remarkable given everything. The fourth thing that changed was sleep, or rather, the slow improvement of it. Ezra had noticed her insomnia in the first week. He'd noticed in the careful, non-intrusive way. He noticed most things: a light under her door at 2 in the morning, the particular tension around her eyes at breakfast, the way she startled at sounds that the others didn't register. He didn't make it a consultation. He made it a conversation, one evening by the fire when the other 3 had gone to bed. "There's a tea," he said. "Valerian and chamomile, some other things. It won't knock you out. It just takes the edge off the hypervigilance, enough that your body can decide to rest." "I'm not interested in being sedated," she said. "I know, this isn't that." He set the tin on the side table between them. "It's your choice entirely. It's there if you want it." She didn't take it that night. She took it 2 nights later, at 3 in the morning, when she'd been lying awake for 2 hours, listening to the wind and cataloging every sound the house made, and finding threats in all of them. She slept for 6 hours straight. She woke up with her heart beating at a normal pace, which had become strange enough to notice. After that, she made the tea herself. She learned the proportions and the steep time, and the particular tin he kept it in. And it became part of the ritual of evening, something that was hers. The trust built the way most real things build, not in dramatic moments, but in accumulation. In Gideon saying, "You're right," without it costing him anything. In Jed's desk appearing, without negotiation. In Larkin's snow blossoms, and the lie about the distance. In Ezra's tea, sitting on the side table for 2 nights, waiting without pressure. One evening in mid-December, with the fire burning high and a blizzard making the shutters rattle, all 5 of them were in the main room at once, which happened more often now and more easily. Gideon had spread a new set of territorial maps across the big table, and Evie was making notations in the margin in her small, precise hand, and Jed was at the fire with his carving. And Larkin was at the window watching the storm, with the focus of someone who read weather as information. And Ezra was reading at his chair. Nobody was talking. It was a comfortable silence, which was a different animal entirely from a tense one. Evie finished a notation and looked up, and her eyes moved around the room without her planning it. Gideon's bent head over the maps, Jed's hands working the wood, Larkin's silhouette against the shuttered window. As Ezra's page turning, she thought about the bracelet again. She thought about the ledger pressed against her ribs that first night. She thought about the key and the coin pouch and the colt on the table and what it had meant to her then and what it meant to her now that she'd had weeks to sit with it. Real masculinity, she was starting to understand, was not the thing she'd been told it was. She'd been told it was authority, ownership, the right to decide on behalf of someone who was deemed incapable of deciding for herself. She'd seen it performed as control, dressed up in protection, and she'd learned to be grateful for it, because the alternative was to admit the cage was a cage. What she was watching in this room was something else. 4 men who were each formidable in different and real ways, strong, skilled, capable of genuine force, and who used exactly none of that force to diminish the people around them. They protected things by building them stronger. They helped by teaching. They gave without accounting for the debt. She turned back to the maps. Something was shifting in her, deep and slow as geological change. She couldn't name all of it yet, but she could feel the ground moving. Evie, Gideon said, without looking up from the survey, what do you make of this parcel boundary here? She leaned over and looked. It cuts across the creek bed, she said, which means when the spring melt changes the course of the water, and it will, looking at the elevation gradient, the legal boundary changes with it. You need a fixed landmark reference, not the water line. He looked at the map, looked at her. I'll write to the territorial surveyor. I'll draft the letter, she said. I know the language they want to see. He pushed the paper toward her and handed her the pen. She wrote the letter. It was a good letter, precise, legally grounded, confident in its claims. When she finished, she set it in front of him, and he read it through twice. I wouldn't change a word, he said. She blotted the ink and let herself feel that for exactly the length of time it took to set the pen down. Then she picked up the next document and kept working. Outside, the blizzard pushed against the walls. The fire held. The house held. And inside it, 5 people were building something that none of them had a fully adequate word for, yet but that all of them could feel taking shape. The storm that hit Bitterroot Ridge on the 14th of December arrived with no warning, or rather, it arrived with the warnings it always gave, a particular stillness in the air. That morning, the animals restless in the stable, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in 3 hours, but the warnings were buried under an ordinary day, and by the time anyone recognized them for what they were, the sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise. Larkin saw it first. He came in from the afternoon trap line at a near run, which was unusual enough that Gideon was at the window before the door had closed. That's not a regular blizzard, Larkin said, pulling the frost from his collar. The cloud formation is wrong. Category 5, maybe. And he stopped. And what? Gideon said. I found tracks on the south approach. Shod horses. 8, maybe 10 riders. They were trying to stay in the tree line. The room changed temperature. Evie was at her desk across the room, working through a set of contract documents. She looked up. She had been living at Bitterroot Ridge long enough by now to know what horse tracks in the tree line meant when nobody was expected. Ezra set down his book. Jed, who had been at the forge attached to the west wall of the house, appeared in the interior doorway, with his hands still dark from ironwork. "Sterling?" Evie said. Not a question. Gideon looked at her. She'd told them about the ledger 3 weeks ago, laid it on the big table, and walked them through every page while all four men listened without interrupting. They knew about the arsenic. They knew about the land deeds. They knew Baron Reginald Sterling was a man who solved problems by removing the people attached to them. Probably his hired men, Gideon said. With a storm coming in, they'll want to move tonight. Use the cover. The sheriff, Larkin said, Hartley, he's been Sterling since last spring. If they've got a foreclosure order. Let them have one, Evie said. Let me see it before you do anything. The men looked at her, not with the dismissal she'd once expected from men in crisis, more like calibration, taking in what she was offering and deciding if it fit the situation. She's right, Ezra said. We don't give them grounds to call us violent until we know what they're actually claiming. Gideon was already moving. Jed, bring the horses in from the pasture. If the stable burns, we lose them. Larkin, get to high ground before the storm closes in. I want eyes on that south approach. Larkin was already reaching for his rifle. Ezra, medical supplies to the cellar. He turned to Evie last. Stone cellar under the kitchen. It's reinforced built for exactly this kind of situation. I want you... No, she said. He paused. She was already moving toward the wall rack, where Gideon kept a spare gun belt, and she took it down and checked the holsters. 2 Colt revolvers, fully loaded. She buckled it around her hips with efficient, steady hands. Larkin had shown her this 3 weeks ago on a quiet afternoon, for reasons neither of them had articulated, but that both had apparently been thinking about. Evie. Gideon's voice had that edge in it, the one she recognized as the boundary between his normal economy of speech and something harder. This isn't a negotiation. I need you in that cellar. You need me where I'm most useful, she said, and I am not most useful in a cellar. She met his eyes across the room. I can shoot. You've seen it. I know the contents of that ledger better than anyone in this building. And if Hartley shows up with a foreclosure order, I'm the one who knows which clauses are forged, because I have the originals committed to memory. She picked up her own Colt from the desk drawer and checked the load. Put me somewhere. The blizzard hit the windows, then a full-force gust that rattled every shutter on the north face and drove a sheet of snow against the glass like a fist. From outside came the distant sound of horses, a lot of them. Gideon looked at her for a long second. Something moved across his face, something that was not quite surrender and not quite agreement, but lived in the country between them. Stay with Ezra, he said. Do not go outside. Understood, she said. They came at full dark, with the storm at half its eventual strength and the temperature still dropping. 8 riders, just as Larkin had estimated from the tracks, and Sheriff Hartley at the front on a gray horse, his tin star catching the light from the torches 2 of the riders carried. They took positions at the edge of the yard, with the calm efficiency of men who had done this before. Behind them, Evie could see, in the deep shadow at the tree line, 2 more figures. Lookouts, maybe. Or a reserve? Gideon stepped out onto the porch alone. Sheriff, he said. Thorne. Hartley had a carrying voice, the kind built for public address or threats at range. I have a duly authorized territorial foreclosure order on this property under Section 14 of the Consolidated Land Act. Baron Sterling holds your outstanding debt instruments and has exercised his legal right to claim this property in settlement. Let me see it, Gideon said. The document came forward via one of the riders, and Evie was already at the window with Ezra behind her shoulder, straining to see. When Gideon brought it inside, just stepped back through the door long enough to hand it to her, she had it in her hands, in seconds. She read fast. Her finger moved down the page, paused, moved again. The debt instruments he's referencing don't exist, she said. This date is before your family filed the original homestead claim. You couldn't owe a debt on land you didn't yet legally hold. She turned the page. And this signature, this is not the territorial clerk's signature. I've seen it on every document in that ledger. Sterling forges it with a leftward slant on the capital T. The real clerk signs with a rightward one. Gideon took the paper back. His face was granite. "It's entirely forged," she said. "Don't let them serve it." He went back to the porch. "This document is fraudulent, Hartley. I'll be challenging it in the territorial court." Hartley's voice, when it came back, had lost whatever veneer of legality it had been wearing. "That's your right, Thorne. But we'll be taking possession tonight and sorting the paperwork after." And then one of the torches flew. It hit the stable roof at the corner, the old dry timber of the overhang, which caught faster than anyone had prepared for. Jed appeared from the stable door at a run, with 2 horses already out and moving, and a third screaming inside. The fire spread with the wind behind it. Everything happened fast then. Too fast. The mercenaries moved on the house from 3 sides, which meant Larkin on the roof was suddenly outflanked on the north approach. 2 of them had rifles, and they knew how to use them. Shots cracked through the storm noise and punched through shutters and the porch railing and the water barrel in the yard. Gideon returned fire from the doorway. Ezra pulled Evie back from the window by her arm. "Kitchen now," he said. She went. She kept the colt in her hand. Jed got the 3rd horse out and turned it loose and came back toward the house at a run. And a rifle shot caught him in the outer thigh, mid-stride. He didn't go down, he staggered, kept running, hit the kitchen door with his shoulder, and came through it in a controlled fall against the table, hand already pressed to the wound. "Through and through," he said, before anyone could ask. "I can walk." "You can't," Ezra said, already beside him, but Jed pushed off the table and did walk, because Jed's relationship with physical limits was complicated. From the front room came the sound of something catching fire. A torch had come through the broken front window and landed on the braided rug, and the curtain beside it was already going. Gideon beat it out with a horse blanket, alone, while Larkin's rifle cracked twice from above, and 2 of the mercenaries outside changed positions fast. The burning roof beam came without warning. One of the stable walls had transferred heat to the connecting breezeway, and the old pine lintel above the main room's north wall gave way. It came down in a rush of fire and sparks and landed across Gideon's left shoulder and back, and he went to one knee. Evie saw it from the kitchen doorway. She moved before she had a thought about moving. Ezra beam. He was already there. Together they got their hands under it. The heat was enormous, and Evie's palms screamed against it and shifted it far enough for Gideon to roll clear. He came up coughing, left arm not moving right, and the look on his face when he registered, who had just helped lift the beam off him, was something she'd think about later when there was time. "Cellar," he said, and his voice had changed. It had the cracked quality of a man whose capacity for argument had been reduced to 0. "All of you now." Larkin came down from the roof, through the interior hatch, fast, and between the 5 of them, they moved for the cellar door in the kitchen floor. Jed was limping hard. Gideon was using only his right arm. Smoke was starting to bank against the ceiling. They got to the cellar door, and Gideon lifted the iron ring one-handed and hauled it up, and in the same motion, all 4 of them gripped Evie Gideon's right hand at her waist, Larkin's hand at her other side, Jed steadying her from behind, Ezra's hand at her elbow, a reflex, all of them at once, moving to lower her down first, to shield first, to protect first, and she understood in a flash of cold clarity exactly what was happening. They were going to put her in the cellar, and then get themselves killed, covering the entrance. She could see it in the geometry of them. They were positioning themselves as a wall between her and the door was where the mercenary leader had just appeared, and he was big, and he was armed, and he had 7 men outside, and a corrupt lawman, and all the momentum of a man who expected to win this. She grabbed Gideon's gun belt with her right hand, and the lapels of all 4 men simultaneously, her left hand catching Larkin and Jed together, while her right fisted in Gideon's belt, and she held. They all held back. 4 sets of hands gripped her waist, trying to lift her, trying to move her to safety, and she looked up at them, and her eyes were burning and clear. "Break me," she gasped. "I need you fierce." The words landed like a match on dry wood. For one fraction of a second, the four of them were completely still. They heard her, not just the words, the demand underneath them. "Stop protecting me like I'm made of glass. Fight like you actually mean it. Be everything you are." Then the mercenary leader shoved through the front door with his revolver up, and something shifted in all four men at once. Some restraint that had been operating since that first blizzard night, some careful, overprotective gentleness that had been trying to keep her whole and had nearly gotten everyone killed doing it. They moved like a force of nature. Gideon crossed the room in 4 steps and hit the mercenary leader's gun arm with his working shoulder, and the crack that followed was not the gun discharging. Larkin went out the window, into the storm, the rifle already swinging up. Jed took a rifle butt to the shoulder and barely registered it, before he locked up the man who'd swung it and removed him from the problem, in a manner that left no ambiguity about the outcome. Ezra had Evie by the arm, pulling her toward the cellar hatch, but he was also tracking everything. Head moving, assessing. "The leader," he said. "He's still." The cellar hatch was half open. The mercenary leader had gotten clear of Gideon's grip and was coming back, coming fast. And Gideon's left arm was not working, and there was fire licking up the wall behind them, and the storm outside sounded like the end of the world. The leader got past all of them. He got past Gideon, who was already turning. He got past Jed, who was dealing with 2 others at the door. He came through the smoke and the firelight and the noise, and he pressed the barrel of his revolver straight against Evie's forehead. The cold of the steel. She felt it. Perfect and specific and absolute. Everything stopped. Behind the barrel, his eyes were calculating. She was leveraged now. She'd seen that look before in a Philadelphia parlor, over a brandy glass, on a face that owned things, and considered her one of them. She heard her own breathing. She heard the storm. She heard Gideon go very, very still, behind her. The leader smiled. "Tell them to stand down," he said. "And nobody's going to." She shot him in the knee. The Derringer was out of her skirt hem and discharged in one motion Larkin's motion, the one he'd drilled into her on cold mornings in the snow, over and over until it lived in her hands and not her head. The revolver barrel swung away from her face as he went down screaming. And the rest of it happened in the next 10 seconds and left no room for hesitation or doubt. But that came in the next chapter. What mattered, in this one, was the freeze frame that hung suspended in the burning, storm-hammered air of Bitterroot Ridge, Evie standing with the Derringer still raised, smoke at the barrel, and the mercenary leader in the floor, and 4 men who had just watched the woman they'd tried so hard to protect save every single one of their lives. The mountain, it turned out, did not need saving. The mercenary leader hit the floor still screaming. Evie didn't watch him fall. She was already moving. She stepped over his legs, clean, deliberate, no hesitation, and pressed her back against the stone wall beside the cellar hatch. The Derringer was empty. She dropped it and drew the Colt from the gun belt at her hip and swept the room the way Larkin had showed her. Threats first. Everything else second. Gideon had the door. He'd taken a rifle from one of the downed mercenaries and was using it left-handed, which would have been impressive at the best of times. His left arm was hanging wrong at the shoulder, dislocated maybe, or worse, but his right hand was steady, and his eyes were flat and focused, and entirely without mercy. Larkin came back. Through the window, he'd gone out. Snow poured in with him. He'd left 2 of Sterling's men face down in the yard, and he was bleeding from a cut above his eye that he appeared not to have noticed. "South. Approach is clear," he said, reloading without looking at his hands. "They're pulling back. How many left?" 3, maybe 4. "Hartley's horse is gone." He wiped the blood out of his eye with the back of his wrist. The sheriff cut and ran, of course he did. Gideon looked at the man on the floor, still moaning, clutching his knee with both hands. Then he looked at Evie. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly. More like a reckoning. Are you hurt? No. She scanned the room again. The burning curtain was out. Someone had dealt with it while she wasn't watching. The roof beam that had come down on Gideon was still smoking at one end, lying across the ruined floorboards. The north wall had a hole in it the size of a man's fist, where a rifle shot had gone through the shutter. Outside, the blizzard was reaching its full strength, and the remaining mercenaries had apparently decided they'd rather survive the storm than press their advantage. Smart choice. Jed, Evie said. Here, he was at the kitchen doorway, still on his feet, by what appeared to be sheer unwillingness to be otherwise. The blood had soaked through his pant leg from mid-thigh to the knee. His color was wrong too pale, jaw set too tight. She crossed to him and got under his arm before he could argue. He let her, which told her how much pain he was in. Jed did not accept help, unless the alternative was falling down. Sit, she said. He sat. Ezra was already there with the medical bag, and they worked together, Evie cutting away the pant leg with Ezra's surgical scissors, while he got the lamp, positioned, and assessed the wound. Through and through, Jed had said, and he'd been right. The bullet had missed the bone and the main vessel, which was the difference between a bad night and a catastrophe. Hold pressure here, Ezra told her, and she did, both hands, while he prepared what he needed. Jed looked down at her hands on his leg, and then up at her face, and he said nothing, because Jed almost never said anything. But something in his expression shifted a quieting, like a man who had been holding something braced and could finally let it ease. You're going to be all right, she told him. I know, he said, and somehow from Jed that wasn't arrogance. It was just fact stated plainly. Gideon appeared in the doorway with the mercenary leader, whom he'd hauled upright with his one working arm, and an expression that had clearly communicated the inadvisability of further resistance. The man was white-faced, his leg useless. All the calculation gone out of his eyes and replaced with the dawning understanding that he had miscalculated everything about this night. Gideon tied him to the chair in the corner with a length of rope from the storage shelf, and then came to Ezra. Shoulder, he said, and sat down without being asked. Evie watched Ezra work on Jed's leg and Gideon's shoulder simultaneously, moving between them, giving Evie instructions, his hands unhurried and exact. He talked as he worked, explaining each step not because anyone had asked, but because information was its own kind of steadying. This is the wound track. This is why I'm cleaning it this way. This is what we're watching for over the next 12 hours. She absorbed all of it, filed it away. When Jed's leg was stitched and bound, and Gideon's shoulder had been reset, a process that produced a sound she would not be thinking about again if she could help it. Ezra turned to her. Let me see your hands. She'd forgotten about her hands. She held them out. The palms were burned from the beam, not severely, but enough, red, and blistered across the fleshy part below the fingers. Ezra cleaned them with the same matter-of-fact care he'd given everyone else. She kept her face neutral. You lifted that beam, he said. We both did. You moved first. She looked at Gideon across the room. He was watching her with those river water eyes, his freshly set shoulders still clearly, hurting in ways he was not going to mention. He'd seen her grab his gun belt. He'd heard what she said. She could see him working through the meaning of it. The same way he worked through land contracts, methodically, without rushing to a conclusion. I wasn't going to let you get killed being careful with me, she said. The room was quiet for a moment except for the blizzard and the moaning of the man tied to the chair, who was rapidly becoming background noise. Larkin dropped onto the bench beside the table, tipped his head back, and laughed. Not at her, just at the whole night, at the shape of it, at how it had ended. She shot him in the knee, he said, to no one in particular, from under her skirt, with a derringer. I drilled that draw, she said. I know. I was there. He looked at her, the real version of his grin, the unperformed one. You counted the shots in his revolver. He had 2 left, she said. I had one. It was math. That's... He shook his head. Yeah, it was math. Gideon stood carefully, testing the shoulder. Then he walked to where Evie sat on the kitchen bench, and he looked at her for a long moment. No one who knew him well would have called his face expressive, but she'd lived with him for weeks by then. She could read it. He put his right hand on top of her bandaged ones. Briefly, the way you'd acknowledge a debt you didn't have the words for. Then he straightened and turned to the rest of the room. "We go to ground tonight," he said. "Cellar until the storm passes, or daylight, whichever comes first. We take him with us." He tilted his head toward the chair. "He's going to answer some questions of Sterling's operations before we hand him to anyone." Nobody argued. They went down together, all five of them, Jed managing the ladder with Ezra one step below him the entire way, the lamp sending long shadows up the stone walls. Evie went last and pulled the hatch down over her head, and the sound of the storm above became a low, constant roar, like something alive and far away. The cellar was smaller than she'd expected, but solid stone on all four sides, dry, with shelves of preserved food, and a small iron stove already laid with wood. Larkin lit it. The warmth started immediately. She sat down on one of the supply crates and looked at her bandaged hands in the lamplight. Outside, miles of Montana winter pressed down on the ridge. The homestead above them was damaged but standing. The men around her were injured but alive. The mercenary leader was gagged now and restrained to a support post, which solved the moaning problem. She thought about that revolver barrel against her forehead, the specific cold of it, how still everything had gone. She thought about the draw, Larkin's voice in her head during those cold mornings. Again, slower. Now again, faster, don't think. Let your hands remember. Her hands had remembered. Gideon sat down across from her. His right arm rested on his knee, and his eyes found hers in the lamplight. "I heard you," he said quietly. "What you said." She held his gaze. "I know you did. You were right." He said it the same way he'd said it over the land contracts, without it costing him anything. "Straightforward. We were protecting you the wrong way. You were protecting me the only way you knew how," she said. "Now you know another." He considered that then. He nodded. Once the same single nod he used when a thing had been decided. Above them, the mountain held. Below it, 5 people sat in firelight and breathed the same air. And that was enough. That was, for the moment, everything. The blizzard ran its course by morning. Not that morning changed much underground. The lamp burned. The small stove kept the chill at the edges of the room rather than the center of it. At some point, Larkin fell asleep, sitting up against the wall with his rifle across his knees, which Evie found either alarming or impressive, depending on how she looked at it. Jed slept stretched out on a bedroll. Ezra had located on a shelf, his leg elevated on a folded blanket. His color had improved. Ezra checked his pulse twice, and both times came away satisfied. The mercenary leader had stopped testing his restraints around midnight. He was awake now watching. She ignored him. Gideon didn't sleep. She knew because she didn't sleep either, not for the first several hours. And every time she looked across the cellar, he was at the small writing table in the corner, working by lamplight making notes, she realized, about everything the man in the restraints had said. Before they'd gagged him, documenting it, building the case. That was Gideon. Even in the aftermath of everything, he was building. She'd been watching him do it for weeks without fully naming it. This was a man whose instinct, when the world went sideways, was to reach for a pen and paper and start creating order. Not because he was cold, because he understood that order was what protected people. She got up and brought him coffee from the pot, sitting on the stove, the only tin cup she could find, which she handed to him, and then settled onto the crate nearest his table. He took it. "The letter to the territorial court," she said quietly. "We need it drafted before we surface." "I know." He pushed a blank sheet toward her. "I was hoping you'd say that." She wrote by lamplight, while the storm wound down above them. He sat beside her and read each paragraph as she finished it, and twice he added something at the margin, and once she crossed out his addition and wrote a better version, and he read it and didn't argue. The rhythm of it was familiar now. She didn't think about that. She just wrote. Ezra woke Larkin at some point, and Larkin took over the watch on their prisoner, and Ezra came and sat on Evie's other side and read the letter as it grew. He had a good legal mind, sharper than he let on, which was a habit among men who'd had to navigate institutions that didn't always welcome them. He caught a clause she'd overwritten and pointed at it without comment, and she fixed it. By the time gray lights started showing around the edges of the hatch above them, they had a 6-page letter of grievance addressed to the territorial court, citing the forged foreclosure instrument, Sterling's pattern of land seizure via fraudulent debt instruments, and a specific request for emergency injunction pending criminal investigation. She set the pen down. Her hands ached. The burns from the beam pulled at the skin when she flexed her fingers. She didn't mention it. "That's enough to get a hearing," Gideon said. "It's enough to get a conviction if we present it right." She looked at the pages. "The ledger does the rest." "Ezra, we need to talk about the arsenic documentation. I want to go through the medical evidence before we file." "Tomorrow," Ezra said. "Tonight you rest." She opened her mouth. "That's not a negotiation," he said, which was such a direct echo of what Gideon had said to her the night before that she almost smiled. The hatch opened mid-morning. Larkin went up first and came back down within 60 seconds. "House is standing," he said. "North wall's got damage. Stable's a partial loss, back half caved, but the frame held. Storm's through, sky's clearing." The relief in the room was physical. They came up into a house that looked like a battle had been fought in it, because one had. The floor was scorched in 2 places. The ruined beam had taken part of the ceiling with it. Every window on the north face was broken or shot out. The cold came straight through, but the walls stood. The fireplace stood. The stone foundation was intact. Jed stood in the middle of the main room and looked at the ceiling and made a sound low and assessing. Then he said, 3 weeks, maybe 2, with help." "You can barely walk," Larkin said. "I can direct," Jed said in a tone that closed the conversation. They worked through the first day in the deliberate, triage-minded way people work when the crisis has passed and the reality of aftermath has taken its place. Board up the windows, assess the structural damage, document everything for the territorial record. Move the prisoner conscious, hostile, increasingly aware that his situation had become legally complicated, to a secure room in the cellar. Evie managed the documentation. She moved through the damaged rooms with a notebook and a measuring eye, recording the destruction with the same precise hand she'd used on land contracts. Larkin shoveled snow away from the foundation. Gideon worked one-armed, without complaint, until Ezra made him stop, and then directed from a chair with equal effectiveness. By evening, the house was cold, but sealed. The fire was rebuilt. Supper was whatever was in the cellar store's dried beans, salt pork, the last of the biscuits Evie had made 2 days before, which felt like another life ago. They ate together at the big table, all 5 of them, and nobody talked much for the first part of it. Just the fire and the eating and the particular exhausted silence that follows a night where things could have gone a different way and didn't. It was Larkin who broke it. "You counted his shots," he said, looking at Evie from across the table, "while he was pointing the gun at you." "Someone taught me to," she said. "I taught you to count before you draw, not while someone's pointing a gun at your forehead." It seemed like the logical moment. He stared at her. Then he shook his head and went back to his food. And the grin was back, the real one, Jed said, from the end of the table, without looking up from his plate. "She counted right." "She counted right," Larkin agreed. The meal wound down. The fire built up high. Ezra checked Jed's leg again and changed the dressing and confirmed what Jed had been insisting all day. The wound was clean. No sign of infection. The man was unreasonably difficult to damage. Gideon's shoulder would take weeks, but the joint had set properly. Ezra's own ribs, it turned out, had taken a bruising from the fall he'd taken through the kitchen doorway that he'd not mentioned at any point during the night. "You could have said something," Evie told him. "It wasn't relevant at the time," he said mildly. "It's relevant now, less so." He pressed his fingers along his side, a clinician assessing his own damage with professional detachment. 2 cracked, probably. Not broken. I'll tape them. Let me, she said. He looked at her. You tape my hands, she said. Let me. He handed her the bandaging and sat still and let her work. She'd watched him closely enough by then to know what she was doing. She was careful, and he was quiet. And when she was done, he tested the breath and nodded. Good, he said. Outside, the temperature had dropped again. With the clear sky, the hard cold that came after a blizzard, when the clouds pulled back and left the stars exposed. The night pressed in close, and the fire held it off, and the 5 of them were all inside those walls that it held, and all alive, and all of them understood exactly what that meant. Something had changed in the room. It had been building for weeks, honest and unhurried, and the night before had stripped away the last of whatever careful distance they'd all been maintaining. Not because of crisis, exactly. More like crisis had clarified a truth that had already been there, the way a fire burns off the fog. Evie looked at the 4 of them, Gideon, with his arm in the sling. Ezra had fashioned, Jed quiet and solid at the table's end, Larkin still wearing dried blood above his eye, because he'd declined to let anyone make a fuss about it. Ezra, precise and watchful and careful with everything. She thought about what Ezra had told her once, over morning coffee, when she'd asked him how a person knew when they were actually safe versus when they were just in a better cage. You'll know, he'd said, because safe doesn't ask you to perform gratitude. It just lets you exist. She existed in this room fully, without apology, without the constant background calculation of what was wanted from her. She was the one who moved first. What followed in that warm, lamplit cellar room was built on everything that had come before it. Every deliberate act of trust, every moment where someone had placed a choice in front of her, rather than making it for her. The physical closeness had its own logic, its own honesty, and there was nothing in it that hadn't been earned. She had chosen. They had chosen. Clear-eyed, warm, uncoerced. That was the whole of it. And it was enough. Afterward, the quiet was the best kind, the settled, undemanding kind that doesn't need to be filled. Larkin had fallen asleep again, because Larkin could sleep anywhere. Jed was still, one arm bent behind his head, looking at the ceiling. Gideon sat against the wall, with his eyes closed, breathing slow and even. Ezra was reading by the lamp he'd found his book somehow, through all of it, which Evie found deeply characteristic. She lay awake and looked at the stone ceiling of the cellar and thought about the ledger, about 14 pages of numbers and names. About 3 women who hadn't run in time. She was going to make sure Sterling answered for them, not because someone told her to, not because she owed anything to anyone, because she could, because she was Evie St. James, and she had survived a Philadelphia parlor and a Montana blizzard and a gun barrel against her forehead, and she was done being a woman who waited to be saved. The fire settled, the mountain held. She closed her eyes and slept. The ledger came out of its hiding place on the 3rd morning after the siege. Evie set it on the big table, in the repaired main room, the north wall boarded over, the scorched floorboards covered with a rug Jed had pulled from storage, the broken windows sealed with oilcloth until the glass could be ordered from Billings. The house looked wounded. It was still standing. That was what mattered. All 4 men sat around the table. Evie opened the ledger to the first page and put her hands flat on either side of it. I've been through this 14 times, she said. I know what's here, but I need Ezra to confirm the medical portion, because when we take this to the territorial court, they're going to want a doctor's name on the toxicology assessment. Ezra leaned forward and pulled the ledger toward him. She'd bookmarked 3 sections with strips of cloth. He opened to the first one. Read, turned to the second. His expression didn't change dramatically, but his jaw tightened by degrees, the only tell he had when something disturbed him deeply. Walk me through what you found, he said. Sterling's first wife was Eleanor Marsh, married 1,861, died 1,863. The death certificate in the ledger is a copy. Sterling kept his own records, which should alarm everyone in this room. Cause of death listed as gastric fever. She pointed at a column of figures on the adjacent page. But here are his household accounts, specific line items. A chemist in Philadelphia, quarterly orders. Consistent amounts over 18 months. Ezra looked at the figures. Arsenic trioxide, he said. In these quantities, ordered this regularly. It's not rat poison, no, she agreed. Second wife, Margaret Holloway. Married 1,866. Died 1,869. Same pattern, 18 months of gradual decline. Gastric complaints. Peripheral neuropathy recorded by her personal physician, who was on Sterling's payroll. She turned the page. Third wife, Catherine Aldous. Married 1,872. Died 1,874. And each time, Gideon said, he inherited the land. Each time he inherited the land. She opened the back section of the ledger. Eleanor's family held 300 acres in Delaware, sold to the railroad the year she died. Margaret's estate included a timber claim in Pennsylvania that Sterling liquidated inside of 6 months. Catherine's family had coal rights in Western Virginia. She looked up. Every property went to the railroad within a year of the wife's death. Different intermediaries, different legal instruments. But the buyer is always the same company. Sterling's company, Larkin said. Sterling is the railroad, she said. He owns the majority stake through 3 shell instruments. It took me 2 weeks to trace it through the ledger's notation system. But it's there. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, Jed was working on the stable. They could hear the rhythmic knock of his hammer, and the sound was steady and ordinary against the weight of what was on the table. He came for you the same way, Ezra said. Not a question. He came for me the same way. My father owed him a very large sum. The bracelet was a wedding gift. The marriage would have been legal inside of a month. She closed the ledger. He'd have started the arsenic within the first year. I have a large inheritance from my grandfather on my mother's side property in Georgia, unentailed, which transfers to a husband upon the wife's death. Larkin said something under his breath that wasn't suitable for documentation. Gideon stood up. What do we need to build the criminal case? Ezra took off his glasses and cleaned them his version of gathering his thoughts. The ledger establishes pattern and intent, but a defense attorney will argue the household accounts are circumstantial. We need exhumation orders for at least one of the 3 wives to confirm arsenic in the remains. Arsenic binds to hair and bone. If Catherine Aldous has been in the ground 2 years, we can still detect it. Who authorizes the exhumation? The territorial court, on application from a licensed physician with documented cause. He put his glasses back on. I have cause. I have documentation. He tapped the ledger. And I have this. Catherine's family, Evie said. Her brother is a lawyer in St. Louis. I found his name in the back correspondence section. Sterling kept a letter from him, threatening legal action in 1875. Sterling must have paid him off or frightened him into silence, because nothing came of it. But he's still alive, and if we contact him with this ledger, he picks up the case in Missouri courts while we run it in the territory, Gideon said. Exactly. 2 jurisdictions, simultaneous. Sterling can't kill a case that's running in 2 places at once. Gideon looked at her across the table. You've been planning this for a while, since the first week, she said. I didn't know if I could trust you with it then, and now? She looked at all 4 of them in turn. Larkin with his cut above the eye still healing, Ezra with his taped ribs and his precise mind already working through the legal framework, Gideon standing one-armed and entirely unbowed, Jed's hammer audible through the repaired wall. Now I know, she said. They spent the rest of that day building the case document. Ezra drafted the medical analysis in the formal language of a court-ready toxicology report. Cause of death inconsistencies, symptom patterns consistent with chronic low-dose arsenic poisoning, the specific household procurement records, cross-referenced against known dosage thresholds. He wrote, with the methodical care of a man who understood his words, would be read by people looking for reasons to disbelieve them, so he gave them none. Evie drafted the legal narrative. She laid out the pattern across all three marriages, the land acquisitions, the railroad connection, the forged debt instruments used against the Thorne homestead. She cross-referenced every claim against a specific page and line in the ledger. When she finished, she read it back aloud, and Gideon listened with his eyes closed the way he did when he was checking something against memory. "The Aldous heir," he said when she finished. "Write to him first. Before we go to court, if he joins the action, the case has standing in two territories simultaneously." "I already started the letter," she said. He opened his eyes. "Of course you did." Larkin rode to Bitterroot, crossing the next morning, with 3 sealed letters, one to the territorial court clerk, one to the Missouri lawyer, and one to the United States Marshal's office in Helena, which Gideon had insisted on. Federal jurisdiction was harder to suppress than local. He came back with 2 things. The first was that Sheriff Hartley had not been seen in Bitterroot Crossing since the night of the siege. His office was locked, his horse was gone, and the deputy, a young man named Coyle, who had apparently not been read into Sterling's arrangement, was managing the town alone and looking deeply relieved to be doing so. The second was a telegram. It had arrived the previous afternoon, addressed to Gideon Thorne from a law office in Helena. Gideon read it twice, then he set it on the table and pushed it toward Evie. It was from Sterling's attorneys. It informed Gideon that Baron Reginald Sterling would be arriving in Bitterroot Crossing aboard his private rail car within the week to personally oversee the execution of the foreclosure order. "He doesn't know what happened to his men yet," Larkin said. "He will soon." Gideon looked at the telegram. "He's coming to finish it himself." Evie picked up the telegram and read it again. Then she set it down and went back to her letter and kept writing. "Good," she said. "Let him come." The private rail car arrived on a Thursday, just past noon. Sterling had timed it for the daylight hours, a man who understood theater, and knew that arriving in darkness looked like hiding. The locomotive was black iron, with a red crest on the tender, and it pulled into the Bitterroot Crossing depot with the slow, deliberate arrogance of something that had never been made to hurry. Evie watched it from the roof of the general store. She'd been up there since 10, with the wool blanket over her shoulders and a clear view of the depot platform and the full length of Main Street. Larkin was 3 buildings east on the feed store roof, his long rifle already positioned. Jed leg still stiff but functional, because Jed's relationship with his own recovery remained entirely. His own business had taken the north end of the street with 2 of the homesteaders from the valley, men who'd ridden in that morning when Gideon sent word. The word had been simple: "Sterling is coming." The response had been 12 men and 1 woman, all of them with reasons. Gideon and Ezra were on the ground, and in her coat pocket, beside the folded case document and the original ledger, Evie's Colt sat loaded and ready. She didn't expect to use it. She planned for the possibility anyway. The rail car door opened, and Sterling stepped out. She'd seen him up close only once, in the Philadelphia parlor, in the cognac and cigar light. He'd seemed larger then, filling a room. Here, in the flat Montana winter, in the actual daylight, he was just an old man in an expensive coat, with cold gray eyes and the well-maintained posture of someone who'd spent 68 years being told he was important. 8 men came off the train behind him. Not the same 8 from the siege. Fresher ones, better dressed, with the air of men hired for visible intimidation, rather than backcountry work. 2 of them carried a document case. The rest carried rifles. Sterling walked to the center of the depot platform and looked at the town like he was appraising property. Deputy Coyle was there to meet him. Young, nervous, holding himself steady through visible effort. "Baron Sterling," he said, "I need to inform you that this office has received a filing from the territorial court in Helena, suspending any foreclosure actions on the Thorn Ridge property, pending." "That filing," Sterling said, without raising his voice, is being addressed by my legal team. It's a procedural delay, nothing more. He looked past Coyle toward the street. Where is Thorne? Right here, Gideon said. He walked out from the side of the depot building and into the open platform. His arm was still in the sling, but he stood straight, and his voice carried the whole length of the structure. Ezra came out behind him and to the left, and his hands were at his sides and visible and empty, which was a specific kind of statement from a man who'd been very careful about how he moved through spaces his whole life. Sterling looked at Gideon the way a man looks at an inconvenience he's surprised to see still standing, Mr. Thorne. I have a valid court instrument. You have a forged instrument, Gideon said, and we both know it. Evie came down from the roof. She'd timed it. She'd planned the timing since the telegram arrived. She came around the side of the general store and walked into the center of Main Street. And she walked straight, and she did not look at Sterling until she was standing in the open ground between the depot platform and the gathered townspeople. 30 people had come out of their shops and homes in the hour since the train arrived. 30 pairs of eyes. She stopped in front of the crowd and turned to face the platform. Sterling saw her. Something shifted in his face, not fear, not yet, more like recalculation. The missing piece of his equation, reappearing somewhere unexpected. Miss St. James, he said. His voice was even, practiced. Baron Sterling. She opened her coat and drew out the ledger and held it up so the people around her could see it clearly. This is your record book. You kept it in the floor, safe in your Philadelphia study. It documents the household accounts for 3 marriages, Eleanor Marsh, Margaret Holloway, and Catherine Aldous, including quarterly purchases of arsenic trioxide from a chemist on Arch Street, cross-referenced against each woman's documented medical decline. Murmurs moved through the gathered crowd. It also documents 14 forged debt instruments, the land acquisitions that followed each of your wives' deaths, and your controlling interest in the railroad company that purchased those properties. She held the ledger steady. We have sent copies to the United States Marshal in Helena, to the Territorial Court, and to the law office of Mr. Thomas Aldous in St. Louis, who is the brother of your 3rd wife, and has been waiting 3 years for exactly this documentation. Sterling descended from the platform. 2 of his men moved with him. He walked toward her with the deliberate pace of a man who had managed dangerous situations before and believed his authority was still intact. A woman's silence, Sterling said, a woman's silence is not consent. Her voice rang down the street and off the false fronts of every building on it. She looked at the crowd, not at him, at the women in front of the milliner's shop, and the homesteaders from the valley, and Deputy Coyle, with his hand on his badge. Our bodies and our lands are not collateral for your greed. This man murdered 3 women for their property. He was going to murder me for mine, and he has been systematically forging legal documents to steal the land of every family on this ridge. Sterling reached for his sidearm. He was fast for 68. He had the gun half out before Gideon crossed the distance between them and hit Sterling's wrist with the heel of his working hand. The weapon clattered to the platform boards. Sterling's arm bent in a direction arms don't generally go, and he went to one knee with a sound that was not dignified. Gideon stood over him. No particular expression on his face, just a man who had done what was necessary. Stay down, he said. Sterling's 8 men looked at the rooftops. Larkin was visible now. He'd stood up on the feed store roof, rifle in hand, not aiming at anyone but very clearly present. The homesteaders from the valley had moved into positions along the street. Jed was visible at the north end, arms crossed, which was somehow more threatening than anything else happening on the street. The 8 men set their rifles down. Deputy Coyle moved forward with a set of irons and the specific expression of a young man who had just discovered his spine. Baron Reginald Sterling, he said, I'm placing you under arrest pending the investigation of the Territorial Court. Sterling, on one knee on the depot platform, looked up at Evie. Whatever he was looking for in her face, he didn't find it. She put the ledger back inside her coat, buttoned it closed, and turned to walk back toward Gideon and Ezra. Behind her, she heard the irons close. Larkin appeared at her elbow from somewhere, rifle slung, snow in his hair, grinning like a man who had thoroughly enjoyed his morning. "You want to know the best part?" he said. "What?" Hartley showed up in Helena 2 days ago, trying to sell information about Sterling's operation. He fell into step beside her. The marshal's office arrested him on arrival. She absorbed that. Hartley turned on Sterling to save himself. "Rats and ships," Larkin said cheerfully. Gideon fell in on her other side, and Ezra just behind, and Jed came up the street to meet them, and the five of them walked together through the middle of Bitterroot Crossing, while the townspeople watched and the prisoner behind them made the sounds of a man understanding what his future held. Evie looked straight ahead. The mountain was visible from the south end of Main Street, the Bitterroot Range, white and immovable against the winter sky. She'd come off a train 3 months ago with $32 and a stolen ledger and blood on her dress, and she had been so cold and so afraid and so absolutely determined not to die. She walked through the town she'd helped protect and felt the ledger against her ribs and the gun at her hip. And she was warm. Spring came to Bitterroot Ridge the way it always did in Montana, without permission, and all at once. One morning in early April, the snow on the south slopes was thigh-deep. By the end of the week, the creek at the base of the ridge was running fast and loud, snowmelt pouring off the peaks, and the first green was showing through the mud in the yard. The air still had teeth in the morning, but by noon it was soft, and the light stretched long into the evening in a way that made the whole valley look like something out of a dream. Jed walked without a limp by March. He'd been walking without one since mid-February, technically, but March was when he stopped, pretending it still bothered him to keep Ezra from fussing. The rebuilt stable stood taller than the original. He'd added 6 feet to the east wall and a proper hayloft and a double-wide door for winter access. He'd done most of it one-handed, directing the homesteaders who came to help with the precise, minimal communication of a man who knew exactly what he wanted built and trusted people to build it, if he showed them how. Gideon's shoulder healed clean. The joint had set properly, as Ezra had promised, and by February he had full rotation back. He spent the months between December and April in correspondence with the territorial court, with Thomas Aldous in St. Louis, with the United States Marshal's Office, with 3 separate newspapers that had gotten wind of the Sterling case and wanted documentation. He sent them the documentation. Sterling's trial was set for June in Helena. The charges were 3 counts of murder in the first degree, 14 counts of forgery, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the Territorial Land Office. Thomas Aldous had arrived in Montana in January with his own legal team and the exhumation order for his sister's grave. Ezra had provided the toxicology testimony. The arsenic was there, in Catherine Aldis's remains, exactly where the pattern predicted it would be. The case was solid. Gideon said so, which meant it was. Larkin rode more freely now. The south approach no longer needed constant watching. He still checked his trap lines every morning, and still came back with frost in his hair and something useful over his shoulder. But the vigilance in him had settled from active to ambient. He taught 2 of the Valley homesteaders' sons to track that winter, the same patient way he'd taught Evie to shoot, no simplification, full respect, the assumption that the person in front of him was capable of learning. He brought snow blossoms again in March, when the south slopes warmed enough for them to push through. He left them on her desk without comment. She put them in the same tin cup. Evie's desk by the east window had become the operational center of something larger than any of them had initially mapped out. It started with the letter she wrote to the women in 3 valley settlements who she'd heard about through the Homesteader Network. Women in situations she recognized from the inside. One of them had a husband who controlled every dollar. One had nowhere to go and no legal standing to file for separation. One had been put off a property claim after her husband died because no one had explained to her that she had rights. She wrote to all three. She explained the rights. She sent money from her own inheritance recovery. The Georgia property had been legally restored to her name in February via the same territorial court process that had suspended Sterling's foreclosure. And she sent the name of a lawyer in Helena who owed Gideon a favor and who had agreed, after a very direct conversation with Evie, to take Frontier Women's cases on a sliding fee. By April, she'd written 47 letters. The idea for the foundation came to her at the big table on an evening in late March while she was working through the response correspondence, and Gideon was sitting across from her updating the land records, and the fire was going, and it was quiet. In the specific, comfortable way evenings had become at Bitterroot Ridge. "I want to formalize it," she said. He looked up the letter writing, the legal referrals, the money for transport. She set down her pen. There are women out here who have no access to any of it, no literacy, no legal knowledge, no means to get out of a bad situation even if they decide to. "I want to build an institution, a formal one, with a name and a charter, and documented funding." She looked at him. "I want to call it the Bitterroot Freedom Foundation." Gideon set down his pen, too. He looked at her for a long moment with those river water eyes. "What do you need?" he said. "Office space in Bitterroot Crossing. A full-time lawyer. I'm already talking to Coyle about law school. He has the mind for it, and the territorial bar exam isn't impossible. A library, because half of what traps women in bad situations is not knowing what the law actually says." She picked her pen back up. "And a shooting range." He was quiet for a beat. "A shooting range. Self-defense instruction. Regular, accessible, taught by someone who doesn't condescend." She looked at him sideways. "I know a sharpshooter." Larkin, from across the room where he'd been pretending not to listen, said, "I'd do that for free." "You'll do it as a paid instructor with a formal curriculum," she said. "We're building an institution, not a favor." He raised both hands in surrender. The charter was filed in May. The foundation's stated mission occupied one page of plain, direct language legal support, literacy education, and self-defense training for frontier women seeking to understand and exercise their rights under territorial and federal law. No small print, no qualifications. Evie had written it herself and read it to all four men before she filed it and asked if anyone had objections. Nobody did. The building in Bitterroot Crossing was a former assay office, solid stone, good bones, 2 rooms, and a backlot big enough for Larkin's purposes. Jed rebuilt the interior in 3 weeks and left the walls bare stone because Evie said she didn't want anything that looked fragile. He put bookshelves along the east wall and a long table in the center room and 6 chairs and a standing lamp by the window. He carved the foundation's name into the lintel above the door. On the morning of the dedication, which was a clear Saturday in June, with the sun full on the valley and the creek running loud at the edge of town, 40 people came. Women from 3 settlements, children, a handful of men who understood what was being built and wanted to be counted as part of it. Deputy Coyle, soon to be ex-Deputy Coyle, Helena bound, in September, for law school, was there. The lawyer from Helena, 2 of the homesteader families who'd stood with them in December. Evie stood on the step of the foundation building and said what she had to say. She didn't read from notes. She knew what she wanted to tell them. She talked about the law and what it could do when you knew how to use it. She talked about literacy as a form of power so fundamental that the people who wanted to control other people had always tried to restrict it. She talked about physical self-sufficiency, not because violence was the answer, but because a woman who knew she could protect herself made decisions differently, moved through the world differently. She talked about what it meant to know your rights and know you were allowed to claim them. Then she opened the doors and stepped back and let people in. The summer built around the foundation, the way summer builds around anything solid filling in the spaces, growing warm against it. Evie ran the legal correspondence and the finances. Larkin ran the range, 2 mornings a week, and he was exactly the teacher she'd expected him to be. No softening. Full respect, total confidence in the people in front of him. 3 women in the first month became proficient with a revolver. 2 of them had never held a firearm before. The library grew. Evie wrote to publishers in Philadelphia and New York and Chicago and told them what she was building and what it needed, and enough of them sent books that she had to ask Jed to build a second shelf. He built 3. The homestead on the ridge rebuilt itself through the summer, too. The north wall was fully repaired by April. By July, Gideon had added a room. He'd been planning it through the winter, Evie discovered, because she found the architectural drawings in the document box one morning in February and asked him about them. And he'd said, without particular elaboration, that the house should be able to hold what it held now. She'd understood what he meant. She hadn't pushed him to say more. On an evening in late August, the 5 of them were on the porch as the sun went down over the Bitterroot Range. The sky went orange, and then deep rose, and then that particular shade of purple that only happened out here, where there was enough sky to hold it. Jed was on the step, whittling. Larkin had his boots off and his feet on the rail, and his face tipped up to catch the last of the warmth. Ezra was reading, because Ezra was always reading, but he'd angled his chair to face the view. Gideon stood at the far end of the porch, with his arms on the rail and his eyes on the mountains. Evie stood in the middle of all of it. She'd been thinking, for the last several days, about what to say at the Foundation's first formal gathering in September. She'd been composing sentences in her head and discarding them, the way she always worked, reaching for precision, rejecting anything that didn't hold its own weight. She had it now. She said it out loud, not because the 4 of them needed to hear it, but because speaking it made it real. I used to think I was a piece of glass that needed saving. She looked at the mountains, the last light on the peaks, the white still holding at the high elevation, even in August. But their fierce respect taught me the truth. Larkin opened one eye. I am the mountain, she said, and no cage can ever hold a mountain. The sun went behind the peaks. The valley went gold and then blue. Jed set down his whittling and looked out at the range. Gideon turned from the rail and looked at her. Ezra set his book in his lap. Larkin put his feet down and sat forward and looked at the mountains like he was seeing them for the first time. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Larkin said, "Put that in the speech. I was planning to," she said. The evening settled in around the homestead, warm and unhurried, and the creek ran at the base of the ridge, and the stars came out one by one over the Bitterroot Range, and on the porch of a house that had been tested and held, 5 people sat in the particular piece of people who had built something real and knew it. The mountain stood. It always had. She came off that train with nothing but $32, a stolen ledger, and blood on green silk. No plan, no allies, no certainty that the next hour wouldn't be her last. And yet she ran, not away from something, but toward the only thing she had left herself. That's the heart of Evie's story. Not the gunfight. Not the courtroom victory. Not even the foundation she built from the ground up in a town that had never seen anything like her. The heart of it is something quieter and harder and more honest than all of that. It's the moment a woman who had been told her entire life that her value was her silence, her compliance, her willingness to disappear, decided she was done believing it. We talk a lot about survival, but survival isn't the same as living. Evie survived Philadelphia. She survived the bracelet clicking around her wrist like a chain around a gate. She survived a father who smiled while selling her. But it wasn't until she stood in a burned, storm-battered homestead with a gun belt around her hips and 4 men at her back, men who gave her a key, a coin pouch, and a weapon, and asked nothing in return, that she started to actually live. The difference between those 2 things is the whole story. What Gideon, Ezra, Jed, and Larkin showed her wasn't rescue. That's the part I want you to sit with for a second, because we've all seen the rescue story. We know how it goes. Someone saves someone. The saved person is grateful. The end. That's not what happened here. What happened here was four men who understood instinctively, practically, without needing it explained to them, that genuine strength doesn't diminish the people around it. It makes room. It builds desks with dovetail joints and leaves knives handle first on washstands and says you're right without it costing anything. It teaches without condescending. It protects without controlling. It trusts people to become what they're already capable of becoming, and then it gets out of the way. That's the version of strength this story is arguing for. Not the loud, owning, bracelet-clicking kind that mistakes control for care. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up in what a person builds for someone else, in how far they ride to find snow blossoms in December, in a cup of tea left on a side table for 2 nights without pressure. And EEV teaches us something just as important from the other direction. She teaches us what it looks like to unlearn fear, to recognize the difference between a cage with comfortable furniture and an open door, to stop apologizing for biscuits that didn't rise quite right, to pick up the pen, write the letter, walk into the middle of Main Street, hold the ledger up in the light, and say out loud what everyone else was too afraid to say. Her arc isn't about becoming fierce. She was always fierce. Her arc is about finally having enough safety around her to stop hiding it. The Bitterroot Freedom Foundation wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion of a woman who learned her rights, claimed them, and, immediately, turned around to make sure the next woman behind her knew hers too. That's what real freedom does. It doesn't hoard itself. It builds a library. It opens a shooting range. It carves a name above a door and says, "This place is for you," and you are allowed to walk in. So if you take one thing from Evie's story, just one, let it be this. The mountain was never the obstacle. The mountain was always her. And no cage, no matter how gilded, no matter how legal it looks on paper, can hold a mountain. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional and created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to real persons or historical events is purely coincidental.